What is the smallest possible spacecraft you could fit a human being into? You'd probably think of the Mercury spacecraft, right? It's often said that the astronauts wore those capsules as much as they climbed inside of them. You can really tell when you look at footage of ingress. They really had to squeeze into those things, and there's just enough room to work the controls and nothing else. Even blowing the emergency hatch would bruise and cut up your hand and elbow from the kickback, and there's just no free space in there. It was the bare minimum space requirements for putting a human being into the vacuum of space. Or was it? The real answer is, the smallest possible crewed spacecraft is a spacesuit. It has all of the requirements, it fully contains a person, it has a pressurized environment, it has its own environmental systems or a tether connecting it to said systems, and in some cases even has its own propulsion system, which isn't a requirement but certainly helps. The history of the spacesuit goes back a long way. Not only do they predate crewed exploration of space, but they predate any exploration of space. Like many things space-related, speculation was abound long before we had the ability to actually make these pursuits off the surface of the Earth. So today, we're going to cover how spacesuits were originally conceptualized, thought out, eventually built, and over time, evolved. From high-minded fiction to preparing to return to the moon, let us begin a study into the history of the spacesuit. In order to design an optimal spacesuit, you need to have knowledge in a lot of different fields. A lot of STEM fields specifically. So it would be very helpful if you had access to education in many different STEM fields all at the tip of your fingers. That's right, this video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is a website and app that teaches you all kinds of STEM concepts in varying levels of difficulty, whether you're already somewhat familiar with the field or not. Brilliant focuses on learning by doing, using interactivity to keep you engaged and help you understand each concept before moving on to the next. No more falling asleep during boring lectures. With Brilliant, you get to directly manipulate the material visually to help improve your understanding. The subjects have a wide range from calculus to geometry to programming to LLMs and much, much more. The problems are designed to scale in difficulty at a reasonable rate, and if you get stuck, there's always the opportunity for a helpful hint. If this has piqued your interest, use my link at brilliant.org/dkis to get a 30-day free trial and 20% off the annual premium subscription today. That's brilliant.org/DKIS. Brilliant. Learn by doing. So, where did the idea of a suit for exploring space first appear? Well, would it surprise you to learn that it was in fiction? Like so many other space firsts, we speculated before we had the chance to try it out in practice. And like so many other space firsts, we speculated somewhat poorly. The thing is, we had some idea of what space would be like before we got there. The atmospheric pressure gradient has been studied and known about since the mid-1600s, so a natural conclusion to air getting thinner with altitude would be that once you get high enough, it's as thin as it can possibly be, to the point of basically not existing. So we did know that we would need contained life support. We would need to be able to breathe in a place that we assumed there would be no air. So, who was the first to depict such special gear? Well, the first mention that I can find, according to this article from High Techer, is an 1815 series of drawings titled Journey to the Moon by English artist Edward Francis Burney. However, I can't actually find a single one of these drawings. The article mentions that the main character dons some kind of special garment that is far from scientific for his voyage to the moon, but doesn't specify how it worked or what it did. It just says it, quote, shielded him from various hazards, and then proceeds to spell the author's name a different way the second time it's mentioned, so I think I'm gonna carefully cross-examine anything else in this article. The first depictions of spacesuits that can actually be relied upon have them very similar to diving suits, and personally I find this a little odd, given that the requirements are somewhat reversed. Underwater, you want to keep a 14.7 psi atmosphere inside the suit while the atmosphere outside is much higher pressure pushing in on the suit. However, in space, the pressure outside is much lower and the pressure on the inside pushes outwards from the suit. The previously mentioned High Techer article cited Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, A Direct Route in 97 Hours 20 Minutes as an early fiction piece featuring spacesuits, but to my understanding, it doesn't actually. First of all, this novel doesn't feature the titular space journey. The majority of the story centers around getting the mission organized and ends with it being launched. The sequel, Around the Moon, deals with the details of the flight and never actually lands on the moon. At no point do the characters leave their spacecraft from what I can tell, creating no need for a suit to be donned at any point. In 1902, the novel was loosely adapted into a silent film by Georges Méliès called Le Voyage dans la Lune, or A Trip to the Moon, but in his typical fashion, it is highly stylized and theatrical, not exactly meant to be taken literally. The astronauts who do land on the moon in this adaptation do not wear suits, perhaps with the assumption that there is an atmosphere on the moon, which is weird because we pretty much knew there was no atmosphere about 150 years before that. However, the moon also has a face, so... Ideas of spacesuits developed throughout the 20th century, with diving suits continuing as the inspiration. The first depictions of Buck Rogers in the late 1920s had the character fully covered in a protective garment and even included a transparent bubble helmet, but there was no description or depiction of life support, pressurization, or anything like that. Presumably it was written off as futuristic technology that didn't really need to depict such things. Cosmic Voyage, a 1936 Soviet silent film, achieved a number of firsts in terms of realistic spaceflight depictions, including a spacesuit. Though clearly still diving suit inspired, the suit used on the surface of the moon has the beginnings of a life support system, and the launch sequence even features something resembling a pressure suit, though at this time practical work on these had already begun. Something we need to keep in mind is that suits that would function for spaceflight were being developed well before we started exploring space. High-altitude flights were being experimented with as early as the 1920s, and as many were being performed with balloons or aircraft that didn't have a pressurized cabin, special equipment was needed. By 1901, the world altitude record was 35,000 feet, and at that altitude, supplemental oxygen is required to stay conscious. Even then, it isn't healthy to stay up there, and you want to start looking at either pressurizing your cabin or having a special suit of some kind. The first known serious concept for a pressure suit came about as early as 1918 when Fred M. Sample submitted his Suit for Aviators patent. It included a metal helmet that was hinged on one side and latched on the other, a hose to be connected to an oxygen tank, and an inflatable bladder underneath the coveralls to provide counterpressure to the chest. This latter part is one of the more essential functions of a pressure suit. With a lack of external air pressure, the body struggles to function. The lungs can overexpand, bodily fluids don't circulate properly, and the lack of pressure creates an insufficient amount of oxygen to be inhaled with each breath. Counterpressure works by applying an artificial pressure to the chest, using the inflatable bladder in the case of Sample's patent, though there are several other methods of doing this. Sample, however, never ended up manufacturing his suit. Several other unsuccessful or incomplete experiments would be attempted, but none resulted in a proper suit. So, enter Wiley Post. The first practical pressure suit came about in 1934. Post was an aviator who, in the previous years, had been performing circumnavigation of the globe in continuously smaller and smaller amounts of time. In 1934, he entered an air race in Australia and began to theorize about powerful tailwinds that existed at high altitudes, what are now known as the jet streams. Though the concept of pressure breathing was still unknown, Post knew that he was going to need some kind of pressurization to keep himself alive at those altitudes. He couldn't pressurize the cabin of the Winnie Mae, a Lockheed C-5 Vega, so instead, he decided to pressurize himself. Post went to the Research Aviation Division of the B.F. Goodrich Company, requesting a, quote, rubber suit which will enable me to operate and live in an atmosphere of approximately 12 pounds absolute, which is around 5,500 feet in altitude. He specified that he expected to fly through, quote, rarefied areas where the pressure is as low as 5 pounds absolute, 27,000 feet, and also mentioned that temperatures were not an issue. He intended to use the heat of the engine's supercharger by coiling it around the exhaust manifolds. This supercharger would also provide compressed air to pressurize and ventilate the suit. Progress was slow. Nobody at Goodrich knew how to manufacture clothes, requiring Post to seek out and hire a tailor to be in charge of that aspect. The first suit was fabricated from parachute cloth with 2 layers glued together to minimize stretching, consisted of 2 pieces sealed with a belt made of a lightweight aluminum alloy, and included pigskin gloves and leather boots. Lowell Peters, a metalworker in Los Angeles, fashioned a helmet for the suit, a 3.5-pound piece generally resembling a welder's helmet with a visor made of 2 layers of clear plastic. A bulge covered each ear for headphone use, and a small door over the mouth could be opened so that Post could eat when the suit was unpressurized. When it was pressurized, it had handles on the lower edges to secure it to the suit, keeping it from rising up. The first suit failed its initial tests. Once pressurized, the wearer could not raise his arms, leaving them hanging uselessly at his sides. A second suit with reworked arms allowed movement with considerable effort, though it suffered a small amount of leakage at the waist which was deemed acceptable, so Goodrich shipped the suit to Post in Ohio. Post, at the time working at Wright Field with the Army Air Corps, took the suit to an altitude chamber to have it tested, where a piece of reinforcing tape promptly failed and the test ended early. However, before returning it to Goodrich, Post made one flight while wearing the suit, though it wasn't pressurized, most likely to simply test its mobility. Afterwards, he returned the broken suit, and a new one was made with improved flexibility and reinforcements. This time, it had two separate layers. An inner rubber layer would be more form-fitting and contain pressurized oxygen, and an outer 3-ply cloth layer would resist stretching and hold the rubber layer to Post's body. It also bolted the helmet to the collar after the wearer was inside, which required assistance from a third party, and the enlarged round window was now made of glass rather than plastic. The first test went relatively well, requiring only small modifications to keep the helmet from lifting when pressurized. On September 5, 1934, Wiley Post flew to an altitude of 42,000 feet wearing the world's first operational pressure suit. He would later take it to a record high of 50,000 feet before he prepared for his stratospheric flights. The 1930s saw several efforts to set new altitude records, and the exceptionally effective nature of Post's pressure suit prompted a surge in development of similar suits. Most suffered problems not unlike the Premier suit. They were heavy, bulky, they restricted mobility, they prevented sweat from evaporating, but they worked for the most part. A less than ideal example is the early German Drager suit, which used a hard shell that was entirely impractical for aviation purposes. The much later Model 8 Drager suit was much improved, dropping the hard shell and allowing the pilot to look around in every direction from within the transparent helmet. Following the end of the Second World War, aeronautics made fast-paced progress. The military and aviation industries were left with a bounty of technological progress, the spoils of war, and how best to utilize those spoils needed to be worked out. Jet aircraft were able to fly faster and higher than ever before, and these quickly uncovered a major safety concern. Cockpits could be pressurized, but what if that pressure was suddenly lost? In the event of an air battle puncturing holes in the cabin, the pilot would have virtually no chance of surviving. Pressure suits now became a necessity, and the air forces of the world went to work refining their designs. The idea was relatively simple. Tubes running along the extremities of the suit could be filled with air, and a helmet could provide oxygen. However, these were found to be very unpleasant and weren't capable of compressing the whole body, leaving loss of consciousness due to a drop in blood pressure a major concern. With a few minimal changes, the United States introduced the MC-3 partial pressure suit, which was useful for undergoing heavy amounts of acceleration. Testing showed it to also be effective in near-vacuum environments, at least for short periods of time. Then along came some of the highest altitude aircraft ever developed, the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird and the North American X-15. The SR-71 flew at such high altitudes that standard oxygen masks were no longer sufficient and a full pressure suit was required. Manufactured by the David Clark Company, the suits also needed to handle an emergency ejection at Mach 3.2, subjecting the wearer to temperatures of around 230 degrees Celsius or 450 degrees Fahrenheit. As a result, these suits also included an onboard oxygen supply that would keep the suit fully pressurized during descent. The X-15, which was basically just a rocket with the bare essentials for aviation wrapped around it, was capable of passing the Kármán line and very briefly entering space, arguably the world's first spaceplane. The pressure suit designed for these pilots was similar to the SR-71 in function, featuring an outer layer that resisted high temperatures and an inner layer that would keep the pilot cool. Engineers now had to choose between what were known as compensating suits, or as they were called for the first time, spacesuits. Both of these methods were used to some degree in practice, but when it came to aircraft like the Blackbird and the X-15, the spacesuit was the better option. They didn't know it yet, but the groundwork had been laid for American spacesuits going forward. Testing of both kinds of suit even involved high-altitude parachute jumps, similar to those made in recent years by people like Felix Baumgartner, and were found to be very effective at their protective jobs. Before we truly start shooting for the stars, we have one other conceptual spacesuit to cover: the British Interplanetary Society Lunar EVA suit. Back in the 1940s, the BIS, established for like-minded individuals to consider the possibilities of exploring space, came up with an idea, a genuinely wacky idea. BIS member Harry Ross headed up a committee looking into the possibility of a mission to the moon, and though the committee was waylaid by the Second World War, afterwards they returned and began working out the details of something that someone could wear while they walked on the moon. By 1949, Ross and Ralph Smith had a working conceptual suit design and wrote a paper for the BIS journal to cover it. Now, of course, by today's standards, it looks a little dated. It genuinely looks like something out of the Middle Ages at a glance, but each aspect of this wild design had a theoretically practical function. Inside were multi-layered textiles to keep the wearer in a protective bubble, while oxygen was supplied and CO2 was removed via pipes, and internal temperature was regulated with a refrigeration system inside the chest. The outside of the suit used a quote highly silvered reflective layer to bounce sunlight off of, and a cape was added to help regulate the temperature of the suit's exterior. The bulky chest piece also housed an airlock system designed for the wearer to retract their arms from the sleeves to open the inner door. This would allow the user to pick up rock samples, place them in the airlock, close the outer door, retract the arms, and open the inner door to examine the rocks, looking down through the large area inside the helmet to the chest area. There was even an idea to have the outer airlock connect to a lunar base so that the wearer could be passed food to consume without having to take the suit off. Of course, the BIS lunar spacesuit was never properly constructed. It never really had a reason to be. However, in more recent years, current members of BIS managed to recreate the suit and put it on display, which is where a lot of this media has come from. We never got to see British moon knights on the lunar surface, but at least we have these beautiful recreations. The real question, would the BIS suit have worked? I don't know. Probably not very well. It seems pretty restrictive for movement, and it's relying on the assumption that the moon is more rocky than it is dusty, hence the cleats on the boots. The outer layer being metal seems iffy. Why make such effort to reflect sunlight instead of just going with the white fabric that most use? Fun fact, that lunar soil analog the suit is standing in? Cat litter. Pretty convincing, right? P.S. shout out to Gentleman's Astronautics for some of these concept images, as he's built an entire alternate history centering around the UK getting to space before anyone actually did, and use of these suits becoming a reality. So, now we reach a transitional point. No longer are we using these suits for high-altitude flights and brief excursions above the Kármán line. Now we are about to have the world's first spacemen, the first astronauts, and the first astronauts need the first true spacesuits. So, what have we got? First, let's go over to the land of hammers and sickles, since they got there first. The Soviets had spent the last decade doing similar development of high-altitude pressure suits, the majority of it being done at a specialized pilot plant now called Zvezda. One of these suits, a more popular one, was called the Vorkuta, designed for use in the Su-9 interceptor. During development of the Soviet Vostok space program, the Vorkuta was chosen as the basis for the first Vostok spacesuit. There were two reasons it was chosen. First, it could be easily configured to work within the Vostok cockpit, and it could also be easily integrated into the Vostok ejection seat, as it was already designed to work on the Su-9 ejection seat. The Vostok spacecraft lacked the kind of launch escape system employed on the US Project Mercury. Instead, the ejection seat was already being used for Vostok landings, so it was made the primary means of emergency escape during Vostok ascent as well. In the event of a launch failure, a Vostok pilot would be able to eject out of the capsule up to 8 kilometers in altitude. After that, well, yeah, let's just say early crewed spaceflight was very, very dangerous. The first suit, the SK-1, was one of a kind, being specially designed for Yuri Gagarin on his Vostok 1 spaceflight, the first ever crewed spaceflight, and therefore the first true spacesuit. It was a full pressure suit with a visored helmet that was not detachable from the suit, and included an inflatable rubber collar in the event of a water landing, a bright orange outer layer designed to make the wearer visible by rescue workers, and a mirror sewn into the wrist to allow the wearer to locate hard-to-see gauges and switches. Variants of the SK-1, not too much modified from Gagarin's prototype, were used on all 6 Vostok spaceflights except for one, the final one, Vostok 6. As this was the first flight of a female cosmonaut, the suit was designated the SK-2 and given small modifications to, quote, take into account the peculiarities of female anatomy, according to one source I found. It took some time to figure out exactly what this means, but it turns out to refer to waste disposal. Yuri Gagarin quite famously had no waste collection system and ended up relieving himself on the back tire of a bus prior to his flight, which later became a Russian tradition. However, all 5 of the other flights lasted a minimum of 1 day, so the world's first, quote, space toilets were integrated into the SK-1 and SK-2 suits. I won't go into too much detail because they're kinda gross, but it's pretty much just a receptacle and a hose, with the receptacle slightly modified for the SK-2 variant to accommodate a woman. Now before we move on, we have to address Tim Dodd's suit. You know him, you love him, the everyday astronaut himself, Tim Dodd, patron of this very channel, ya boy Tim Dodd, bought himself an old Soviet spacesuit once. It's actually not exactly a spacesuit, it's a VSMK-4, a Soviet high-altitude partial pressure suit from 1970 made for naval aviation pilots. However, as we've established, the line between aircraft pressure suit and spacesuit is pretty gray, so I don't see anything wrong with calling his suit a spacesuit. You could wear that on a Soyuz launch, why not? Anyway, Tim's suit nearly killed him once. He He purchased the suit before he had the vested interest in spaceflight that he does today, and primarily used it for the purposes of a space-themed photo shoot, as photography was one of his main activities at the time. Upon purchasing the suit, he immediately tried it on, as you do, closed the helmet down over his head, and locked it in place, then quickly realized he didn't know how to unlock it, and he couldn't breathe. He managed to pop off the cover of the air hose and breathe through that until he figured out how to unlock the helmet. He then went on to do a photo project involving wearing this suit while doing mundane everyday tasks, eventually leading to the persona of the everyday astronaut, the thing he is most known for today. Now, what about the Americans? What was their first spacesuit like? Back in the late 1950s, as Project Mercury was first being organized, the brand new NASA had two options for a first spacesuit: the X-15 high-altitude suit or the Navy Mark IV pressure suit. Manufactured by B.F. Goodrich, the same good folks who made Wiley Post's suit, they gave several Mark IV suits to NASA for the agency to evaluate, and they quickly began to do work in modifying it for spaceflight. The finished product had an inner layer of neoprene-coated nylon fabric and a restraint outer layer of aluminized nylon. The ability to bend the knees and elbows was provided by simple fabric brake lines sewn into the suit, which works fine when the suit is worn soft, as it mostly was, but in an emergency when the suit was pressurized, astronauts found it very difficult to move at all. Thankfully, pressurization was an event that would only occur if the Mercury capsule suddenly became depressurized, which was an event that never happened, so the situation never needed to be explored in a live test. Some argue that it wouldn't have mattered much anyway. In the tight quarters of a Mercury spacecraft, one was barely able to move as it was. Each Mercury suit was custom fitted for the 7 astronauts of the program, and here's a further fun fact about them. The Mercury program moved fast. Despite lagging behind the Soviet Union's early spaceflight efforts, it was very much a crash program that lived by the motto of move fast and break stuff. So when the time came to have the astronauts line up and do a photo shoot with their suits on, the suits weren't actually completely ready yet. Can you see it? Have a look at the shoes of Deke Slayton and John Glenn, front and center. The boots for their spacesuits weren't quite ready yet, so NASA gave them a pair of standard steel-toe construction site work boots and spray painted them silver. Some aspects of Project Mercury are as scuffed as a low-budget movie from the 80s, and I kind of adore that. It is worth noting though that these boots aren't really part of the suit. The full suit covers the feet, and the boots simply protect that portion of the suit. Now, we're reaching another transition point here. First, we went from use in high-altitude aircraft to use within pressurized capsules in the vacuum of space. Now, our astronauts are making new strides, and new world firsts are about to be attempted. We're talking about spacewalks, people. Being out in the void with nothing between you and space except for your suit. The thing is, as functional or non-functional as they were for emergency depressurization, neither the SK nor the Mark IV would function as an EVA suit. New changes needed to be made to make spacewalks a reality, and as we did previously, let's start with who did it first. The Berkut suit, meaning Golden Eagle, was developed by Zvezda for use in the Voskhod program in the mid-1960s. Most know the iconic image of Alexei Leonov performing the world's first spacewalk, floating away from the Voskhod spacecraft with a tether keeping him attached to it. However, the details of this momentous flight are often forgotten. For one, unlike the American Gemini equivalent, the tether did not provide life support, merely working as a safety measure, though it did contain an emergency oxygen supply if it was needed. Breathing and cooling oxygen was contained in a small backpack, which held 3 2-liter cylinders with enough oxygen for 45 minutes of unpressurized activity. The backpack was separate from the suit and will be put on directly before the spacewalk, connected via a hose and secured with a harness. The suit also featured a relief valve located near the hip, allowing the wearer to vent heat, moisture, CO2, and if necessary, excess oxygen from the suit. It was a good thing it was there, too. So, how well did the suit work? Well, in terms of basic protection from the vacuum, not bad. It did the job of providing a suitable pressurized environment to be in while floating in space, sort of. It had 3 layers, 2 inner sealing layers and an outer layer for thermal protection, and these functioned relatively well. However, the Voskhod 2 spacewalk had a myriad of problems. From the moment he stepped out of the spacecraft and let go, Leonov realized this was not going well. He had no means with which to orient himself, so he had to just wait in a free-floating, uncontrolled spin until the tether reached its limit and jerked him to a stop. At that point, he grabbed the tether and used it to reel himself in, and began to notice that his suit was changing shape. It had begun to balloon outwards, restricting his movements further and causing his hands and feet to slip out of the gloves and boots. He had 2 tasks for his spacewalk: attach a camera to the end of the airlock to record himself, and take photographs of the spacecraft. He managed the first task, But the suit's ballooning problem prevented him from being able to reach the camera attached to his chest. As the ballooning didn't immediately stop, Leonov's worries quickly changed from completing the tasks of his spacewalk to getting back inside at all. He became concerned that the more the suit changed shape, the lower the chances were that he would be able to get back inside the spacecraft. After the 12 minutes of the EVA activity were over, he tried to get back inside, and his fear was quickly realized. He didn't fit. He was able to enter the inflatable airlock, but he wasn't able to turn around and close the hatch. Remembering the relief valve, Leonov used this to slowly vent the oxygen from his suit down to about half of what it should have been, flirting with decompression sickness until the suit was small enough for him to close the hatch and re-enter the spacecraft proper. He did this head first, which he wasn't supposed to do, and the extra exertion brought him close to heat stroke territory as the oxygen was no longer cooling the suit. He did eventually, however, manage to sit down and return home safely. Many years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Leonov would state in an interview that if things had gone just a little worse and he wasn't able to get back inside, his superiors had provided him with a pill in his helmet that he could take so that he wouldn't have to slowly suffocate to death. Early crewed spaceflight was truly the stuff of nightmares. So, how did Project Gemini compete with the Berkut suit and the achievement of Voskhod 2? Yes, it's pronounced Gemini, we've been over this, check out the short.
Gemini began counting down. Gemini 1.
The prime pilots for the Gemini 6 flight, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford.
Astronaut John Young, command pilot of Gemini 10.
Gemini number 1 lifted smoothly off the pad.
Introducing the G3C and the G4C. Returning to the base design of the X-15 pressure suit, the Gemini spacesuit was designed and built by the David Clark Company. The first variant was the G3C and was worn for only one flight, Gemini 3, as it wasn't intended for EVA use. It had 6 layers of nylon, with the innermost containing a rubberized nylon bladder for pressurization, came with removable combat-style boots, and a full-pressure conformal helmet with a neck ring and bearing that operated independently of the rest of the suit, which allowed the wearer to turn their head and have the helmet turn with them. The G4C suit, used for most of the remaining flights, was largely identical but had a few changes. It had extra layers of mylar for thermal insulation, able to withstand up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit and 121 Celsius in sunlight, or negative 250 Fahrenheit and negative 157 Celsius in shadow. It also came in 2 variants. One, a pilot's suit, had integrated boots and a detachable sun visor for the helmet, and on the other variant the boots were removable as they were on the G3C. On the front was the attachment for the tether, which provided oxygen for cooling and breathing, and above that was a second attachment system for communications equipment and for biomedical sensor data. As the suit relied on oxygen and power via the tether with the spacecraft, spacewalks could last much longer than in the Berkut suit, some taking up to 2 hours. Gemini 4 saw the first American spacewalk with Ed White, and this gives me an opportunity to talk about how preparation for a spacewalk goes, as the NASA procedure was more open to the public than the Voskhod one. In fact, as far as I can tell, many of these steps simply weren't taken for the Voskhod spacewalk, as the focus was on getting it done first and racking up another achievement for the Union. First, the cabin's atmosphere would be switched from a nitrogen-oxygen mix to a pure oxygen environment, which the astronauts needed to breathe for several hours. This allowed the air environment within their bodies to be purged of nitrogen, which reduces the risk of decompression sickness, also known as the bends. Following this pre-breathing procedure, the cabin was depressurized slowly over the course of 30 minutes to keep the environment safe for the astronauts. The Gemini craft contained no airlock, so the entire capsule had to be vented of atmosphere, meaning both crew members would fully don their spacesuits. Then, finally, after a brief issue with the latch of the spacecraft, the door was opened and Ed White stepped outside. White was equipped with a handheld maneuvering unit, essentially a can of compressed air that White could fire with a trigger, intending to allow him to control himself in space more easily than Leonov was able to. While White would describe the gun as useful and stated that he had fun using it, he quickly ran out of propellant, and fellow astronaut James McDivitt described it as being utterly useless due to requiring very precise alignment with the user's center of mass to keep from spinning when firing it. Most of White's time during the EVA was spent practicing moving around the spacecraft while McDivitt watched and took photographs. While the mission lacked the ballooning problems experienced on Voskhod 2, it was not without its own issues. The introduction of a brand new Vox communication system resulted in White being unable to hear mission control the majority of the time, with most communications being relayed to him via McDivitt. Because of this, mission control became increasingly frustrated due to the time constraints of the mission. They really wanted to end the spacewalk before the spacecraft passed to the dark side of the Earth, and White's inability to directly talk with them was making everything take much longer than it should have. When White finally did get back into the capsule, the latch problems with the hatch returned. The two astronauts struggled to get it fully closed, a potentially deadly situation for atmospheric re-entry. In fact, once they got it closed, they were supposed to open it again to throw out some of White's unneeded EVA equipment, but chose not to risk having the hatch problems rear their ugly head once again. The G4C spacesuit was used for every remaining Gemini mission except for one, though modifications were made throughout the program. Later Gemini spacewalks intended to prove that useful work could be performed during an EVA, requiring longer periods outside the spacecraft. For this reason, much of the life support equipment was moved to the chest of the suit, known as the Extravehicular Life Support System, or ELSS. This was designed primarily to ensure 20 minutes of life support in the case of a suit leak, allowing the astronaut to safely return to the spacecraft, and also served as a platform for tools to be held. The zip gun used by Ed White was altered to be fed oxygen first by a backpack for Gemini 8, but was never used, then from the spacecraft itself on Gemini 10. The United States Air Force developed the Astronaut Maneuvering Unit, a backpack-like device that an astronaut could wear as an improved propulsion method, though it was never successfully tested. Despite this, some G4C suits were modified to have better thermal protection due to the hot gas that would be expelled by the AMU. Constraints of the Gemini flights led to the AMU never being used, and this middle child between the zip gun and the MMU would be mostly forgotten. Deke Slayton later speculated in an autobiography that the Air Force had developed it for the purposes of, quote, inspecting the satellites of other countries. By Gemini 12, NASA had proven that work could be done in outer space. Buzz Aldrin, then a rookie, performed 3 different spacewalks to perform various tasks, such as attaching a tether to an Agena target vehicle and performing photographic observations of the Earth and the Gemini spacecraft. Prior to this mission, NASA had introduced a new form of training for spacewalks that proved exceptionally effective and will continue to this day: underwater training. Spacewalks were now becoming smooth and effective procedures for doing work in outer space rather than simple experiments to find out whether or not such a thing was even possible. One other suit was used for the Gemini program, the G5C. Technically a modified G3C, this was used for Gemini 7, which was the longest of the program, taking 14 days to complete. A few modifications had been made. The pressure helmet was replaced with a zippered hood incorporating a clear fixed polycarbonate visor under which the astronauts wore a Navy-style aviator crash helmet that held the communications equipment. Additionally, the suit featured extra zippers for adjustment and provisions for the suit to be fully removed during flight, which Jim Lovell did during the second day of the mission, being the first astronaut to ever remove their spacesuit within a spacecraft. While NASA was making strides with Gemini and arguably beginning to take the lead in the space race, the Soviets were beginning the Soyuz program. Beginning as the Soviet lunar program and eventually becoming the primary crewed spaceflight program of the USSR and later Roscosmos, Soyuz was somewhat unique in its early days in that no spacesuit was used for the majority of the flight. No pressure suit was worn for launch and re-entry, and while in orbit, the crews wore simple flight suits that offered no protection from the vacuum. However, during these early flights, an improvement of the Berkut suit was developed for EVA purposes, called the Yastreb. As a matter of fact, Alexei Leonov himself served as a primary consultant on the Yastreb design process to suggest improvements based on his own experiences, though use of the suit was significantly delayed by the Soyuz 1 disaster in 1967. It improved on the Berkut design by using a system of pulleys and lines to combat the ballooning experienced on the previous suit. It also featured a life support system worn on the chest this time, similar to the Gemini ELSS, but could also be strapped to a leg if one so desired. Requiring 2 cosmonauts for one person to don the suit, it was used exactly once on the Soyuz 4 and 5 mission, which saw 2 of the crafts dock together to perform the first in-space crew exchange and the second Soviet spacewalk. In classic Soviet fashion, there's very little media about this mission, but the crew struggled with the Yastreb suit. Upon exiting the spacecraft, cosmonaut Yevgeny Krunov had a line in the suit get tangled, and when he tried to fix it, he accidentally closed the suit's ventilator tumbler. This distracted the other cosmonaut who was supposed to film the spacewalk, though the primary goals of transferring crew and materials from one spacecraft to another were achieved. Now at this point, we reach another transition point in the world of spacesuits. We've stepped into the void and floated there, figured out how to move between spacecraft, how to work in outer space, but now we need a suit to set foot on solid ground again. Now it's time to go to the moon. The Apollo program was truly unprecedented stuff. We had a very vague idea of what the surface of the moon was going to be like, but a lot of that was occurring as Apollo development was. The first soft landings on the moon didn't occur until 1966 with the Soviet Luna and American Surveyor spacecrafts. Prior to seeing it up close with our own eyes, many people imagined that the surface of the moon was a much rockier and less dustier place than it turned out to be. So, right up until just before we got there, we had virtually no idea what the surface of the moon would look like up close, which led to some of the wackiest ideas in space design history. This is a good chance for me to explain a curious thing that happens when NASA puts out a design contract. Here's a very, very rudimentary breakdown of what happens. NASA announces that they need a thing. They need a new capsule, a lander, a probe, whatever equipment is needed for a new mission that's being attempted. Then, companies who are capable of providing the thing start to submit proposals. As they all really want to get the contract, it's pretty much a situation of throwing all of the spaghetti at the wall, and some of the proposals are often a little out there. Eventually, whoever has the best and cheapest proposal wins the contract and is paid money to develop the thing that NASA wants. In the case of the Apollo lunar EVA suit, there were some genuinely wild proposals. Let's take a look at some of them, shall we? Now, bear in mind, some of these images have very little context attached to them, but I'll try to find what I can. This first one actually predates the Apollo concepts, in fact by a full decade, but I'm including it here because it was intended for lunar surface exploration. Aerojet engineer Alan B. Hazard proposed this idea, which is ironic because it seems very hazardous indeed. A semi-hardshell design, a concept that still hasn't been fully designed to this day. There's very little information on its details, but it is known that most of the controls were located directly in front of the astronaut's face within the helmet area. This can be seen within this magazine spread, which is basically the most amount of information we have about this weird thing. This next one I have virtually no information on, but just look at it. According to the person who shared it with me, thank you Cost in Space on Twitter, it was designed in 1964 by Johns Hopkins University and was called the SX-1, but that's all I've got. The idea seems pretty self-explanatory. The ball gives the wearer full range of motion within it, and they can roll it to move around like a hamster on the surface of the moon. To interact with the environment, they can put their hands through the arm sleeves the same way one interacts with hazardous materials in a laboratory on Earth using isolator gloves. Of course, the problems with this idea are also apparent, especially given what we know now. The entire suit is a potential puncture point, and there looks to be zero protection whatsoever against depressurization. Not a safe idea. In the end, the suit contract was given to a familiar face, ILC, the International Latex Corporation, who designed the X-15 pressure suit. More specifically, ILC Dover, and here's where a popular misconception comes into play. You may have heard that the famous bra manufacturer Playtex was responsible for the design of the Apollo suit. Well, sort of. You see, Playtex was started in 1947 by ILC as a division to manufacture latex products such as shower caps, swimsuits, rubber dinghies, and yes, undergarments. Playtex then created a division called the Metals Division, which would eventually become ILC Dover, and they were responsible for the final A7L suits worn on Apollo missions. The thing is, large companies often make a pretty wide variety of products based on their capabilities, so it isn't overly surprising that a company capable of making a bra is also capable of making, say, a rubber dinghy for the military, a gas mask, or a pressure suit. Chrysler, for instance, has made family automobiles, military vehicles, and the first stage of the Saturn 1B rocket. Anyway, ILC's development of the Apollo suit was a little complicated, as the end goal was a constantly moving target. Apollo was a bit of a crash program. It moved fast because it was politically motivated and had its stated goal of achieving a crewed lunar landing before 1970. Between 1962 and 1965, ILC produced several variations of the suit, slowly adding new performance requirements as they became apparent, eventually coming up with the A5L suit, which was used for testing and discussions around final improvements. Finally, in 1968, the most popular version of this suit was created, the A7L, worn from Apollo 7 to Apollo 14. At the same time, Apollo suit development was overall a complicated mess of cutthroat corporate competition, poor communications between multiple contractors, and multiple rounds of call-outs for proposals. Quite frankly, the timeline of Apollo suit development could be its own video, and one day might be, but it would be a little boring for this video to get derailed with 5 minutes of, this company won this contract, but this other company won a different one, and then they wouldn't communicate together and they were forced to start over, and then another company was hired to make a backup backpack, but that was canceled when the first round backpack started working, and on and on and on. So let's just skip ahead to the end product, the A7L, and how that worked. The A7L suit consisted of several parts. The very bottom layer, worn tight to the skin, is the liquid cooling garment. This layer had plastic tubing throughout it which circulated water to cool the astronaut, provided from the Portable Life Support System or PLSS backpack, which we'll get into. This circulated water would also prevent the suit helmet from fogging up and minimize sweating within the suit. On top of the liquid cooling garment was the Integrated Torso Limb Suit Assembly, also known as the ITLSA. A gas-retaining bladder structure that required the upper and lower arms, legs, torso, and boots to be assembled and connected individually, the ITLSA provided a full pressurized environment for the wearer, as well as some protection from micrometeoroids. It used a series of complicated joints to allow for low-torque body movement without disrupting the overall gas pressure within the suit. The inner surface of this assembly was covered in a textured nylon fabric that was bonded to it, which protected the bladder from scuffs, abrasions, and snags. There was also a comfort liner layer which could be removed for cleaning and inspection. The outermost layer of the suit was called the Integrated Thermal Micrometeoroid Garment. This part of the suit, which provided the most protection from solar radiation and micrometeoroids, consisted of 14 different layers of varying materials: rubber-coated nylon, 5 layers of mylar, 4 layers of Dacron, 2 layers of Kapton film, and Teflon-coated filament cloth. There were also various patches of Teflon on the knees, waist, and shoulders to protect from abrasions, and some on the back specifically to protect from the life support backpack. Beginning with Apollo 13, the commander's suit had red bands added to each arm and leg, as well as on the helmet. Initially called Public Affairs Stripes, these were later renamed to Commander's Stripes, but served no practical purpose. Their only function was to allow those watching to differentiate the two astronauts while they walked on the moon. This trend would continue with the later EMU, but dropped the Commander designation, simply being used to tell the two apart. Now, onto the backpack. The PLSS had a lot of requirements that were unknown until late into its development phase, and over the 10-month contract, the first backpack was not completed until the final month. One of the biggest factors was how much life support was needed. For a spacewalk, the astronaut barely needs to exert themselves, being free-floating and moving objects around in relative weightlessness. However, the simple act of needing to walk, climb, bend, flex, and operate equipment in an environment with gravity, even 1/6 of normal gravity, requires more physical exertion, thereby increasing the requirements for life support per hour. At the same time as suit development progressed, the metabolic requirements went down as the newer designs created lower effort mobility and had improved ventilation systems. There were two primary elements to the Apollo life support system: the PLSS and, mounted on top of it, the OPS or oxygen purge system. The PLSS provided life support normally during EVA activity, but if it were to suddenly break, the OPS would provide an emergency backup while the astronaut quickly retreated into the lunar module. Oxygen tanks provided the breathing air as well as cooling and suit pressurization, and lithium hydroxide canisters scrubbed CO2 from the breathed air before recirculating it into the suit. Water pumped through the liquid cooling garment to absorb the heat of the astronaut's body, where it would then be pumped back into the PLSS and be frozen by the low temperatures of space. Following this, a sublimator would convert it directly into a gas, the usable oxygen being kept for breathing and pressurization. Integrated into the PLSS was the communications equipment. You can see the main antenna sticking out of the backpack in a lot of the footage. To cap it all off, the PLSS was powered by a singular rechargeable silver zinc battery, and the entire system provided life support for around 4 hours of time on the lunar surface. The A7L suit provided unprecedented levels of ability and safety in a brave new world of spaceflight, protecting 6 people against the razor-sharp and clingy lunar regolith, though it did quickly coat the lower portions of the suit and make them dangerous to handle after the lunar spacewalks. However, the first 3 lunar landings went exceptionally well, with a few quirks and bumps here and there, and the spacesuits functioned more or less perfectly. For Apollo 15, 16, and 17, the suits were heavily revised, now called the A7LB. 2 new joints were added to the neck and waist, mainly to allow astronauts to operate the lunar roving vehicle. Adding these joints required a complete revision of the 6 life support connection cables, as well as a relocation of the up and down back zipper. The PLSS was also modified to provide life support for up to 8 hours, with the longest EVA on Apollo 17 at a length of 7 hours and 36 minutes. The longer EVAs even included provisions in the suit helmets such as energy bars to be consumed partway through. The PLSS batteries were also upgraded to help them last longer and given more water for cooling over a long duration, a feat achieved with only a small upscale in volume. Fun fact, no actual worn PLS is available today from the Apollo program, as they were all left on the lunar surface to discard weight and volume in exchange for more lunar surface samples. You might see one with an Apollo astronaut's name on it in a museum like this one, but they were only worn for training on Earth. Before taking off from the lunar surface, the astronauts would switch to the OPS oxygen supply, toss the backpacks out the door, then close up and get ready to head home. The A7LB suits continued to provide all the protection needed, but weren't without dangers. Charlie Duke on Apollo 16 recalled an occasion where, when essentially just fooling around, he very nearly died. He was performing high jumps on the lunar surface, and at one point underestimated the weight of the PLSS backpack. He tipped over and landed on his back, and would later state that if he had fallen a little harder or a little differently, the fiberglass casing of the PLSS could have cracked, and he could have been in serious trouble.
Wow. Charlie, that ain't any fun, is it? That ain't very smart.
And as I fall over backwards, fear strikes. If I split my suit open, I'm dead. As John helps me up, I get very, very quiet as I listen to the pumps and the oxygen flow in the suit.
Though realistically, he would still be able to use the OPS on top to get back into the LEM, assuming he didn't also crack that. Overall, the Apollo suits were effective, but not exactly ideal. The amount of regolith they collected filled the cabin of the lunar module after the spacewalks. The astronauts struggled to bend down, operate tools, and even walking was extremely strenuous. The reason you often see astronauts bunny hopping around on the lunar surface is because it was easier than walking normally. They got the job done, but it wasn't exactly comfortable or easy.
Right, they say give it a slight rotation clockwise as you're lifting out.
Okay. EVA flight. Hey there.
ILC Dover was funded to perform modifications on the A7LB suits for use on Skylab, NASA's first space station following the end of the Apollo program. Around this time, NASA had a heavy shift in focus toward cost reduction and operating on a budget, and almost everything about Skylab was a reflection of this, including the spacesuits. The fairly expensive PLSS was replaced with the ALSA, or Astronaut Life Support Assembly, an umbilical assembly designed by AI Research, who had won a contract for a never-needed backup PLSS design during the Apollo era. An emergency oxygen supply was also strapped to the astronaut's thigh in the case of umbilical failure, providing 30 minutes of extra oxygen if needed, though they never were. The A7LB suit was used one final time for the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, which involved the docking of an Apollo Command and Service module to a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft, the first international collaboration in space. No EVA was planned for this mission, so the suit was somewhat simplified, again discarding the PLSS, as well as the relief valve and a handful of gas connectors, but otherwise remaining more or less the same. This was the last time an Apollo-era suit would be worn by a NASA astronaut, but before we come to what's next, we must hop across the globe again. As I mentioned, the early Soyuz flights involved no pressure suit for launch and re-entry until 1971. Soyuz 11, launched on June 7th, was the first flight to successfully dock with and board the world's first space station, Salyut 1. Their stay aboard went relatively normal, but when they undocked and headed home, disaster struck. After the deorbit burn, the spacecraft separated into its 3 individual parts, and a design flaw caused a ventilation valve to be jolted open, very quickly depressurizing the entire descent module. All 3 crew members, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, quickly asphyxiated, being found dead after the automatic landing sequence was completed. These 3 remain to this day the only human beings to have ever perished in the vacuum of space, and the failure quickly prompted a change in launch and re-entry procedures for Soyuz flights. NPP Zvezda once again stepped up, designing a modified version of the Sokol aviation pressure suit, removing its unneeded components and altering the design of its helmet. OKB-1, the bureau also responsible for Soviet probes and spacecraft, designed the life support system to be integrated with the suit and the Soyuz spacecraft. The new suit was named the Sokol K, the K standing for Cosmos, which is the Russian word for space. The inner pressure layer was made of a nylon polymer, while the outer layer was white nylon canvas. The boots are integrated and non-removable, a pressure gauge is mounted on the left wrist, and a mirror is worn on the right wrist via an elastic band. During re-entry, an altimeter can also be worn to check on cabin pressure, as well as brace for touchdown before landing. Life support for a Sokol suit resembles that of scuba equipment, an open-circuit system that is high on oxygen consumption, which is considered acceptable as pressurization is only used in emergency situations. 2 hoses are used. One connected to an electric blower ventilates the suit with air, while the other hose is used for breathing oxygen. Air and oxygen exhaust are vented through the relief valve in the center of the chest, which also regulates the suit's pressure. If the cabin's pressure drops below a certain limit, the suit's air and oxygen is automatically replaced with oxygen from pressurized bottles. Each Sokol suit is made to measure, with the cosmonaut or astronaut spending 2 hours sitting on a launch couch with an inflated suit to ensure it fits correctly. Straps on the arms, legs, and waist can be adjusted slightly to more snugly fit the wearer. The suit is entered legs first after the 2 zippers that form a V on the chest are opened. After the legs, the arms, and then helmet are fitted, and an airtight seal is formed by rolling up the inner pressure layer and securing it with strong elastic bands. While it's been updated over the years, variations of the Sokol suit have been around since 1973, with over 300 of them being built and worn over the years. However, these are flight suits, not EVA suits. Enter the Orlan. Designed again by MPP Zvezda and first used in 1977, the Orlan continues to operate alongside the Sokol to this day as Roscosmos' primary EVA suit. Originally intended for use as a lunar EVA suit, that particular design was never finished, and the first ones were used for the Salyut program, then were updated for Mir. Composed of a single piece, Orlan suits are entered via a hatch in the rear of the torso, with the exterior of the hatch housing the life support equipment. The suit is pressurized to 0.40 atmospheres, which means cosmonauts only need a 30-minute pre-breathe before suiting up. With all of the life support being integrated into the suit, it required no umbilicals like the Skylab EVA suits, and originally lasted up to 3 hours on a spacewalk. Later versions of the suit extended this time to up to 9 hours, and were designed to last for either 4 years or 15 EVAs, whichever came first, after which they would need to be discarded for safety reasons. One instance of this suit retirement resulted in what I consider to be the single creepiest real spaceflight video in existence. In 2006, an empty, retired Orlan suit was hand-launched away from the International Space Station in an experiment called SuitSat. The suit was no longer within safety standards and couldn't be used, so instead of expending resources returning it to Earth or simply discarding it, it was first fitted with a transmitter before being sent away, allowing it to function as a rudimentary communications satellite. The experiment was only partially successful, as the same year it was deployed, the suit stopped responding. While simplistic and relatively easy to manufacture, the Orlan suit's rigid torso provides limited mobility and tends not to last as long as what the Americans would develop next for the Space Shuttle program, the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, or EMU. This would be the first suit developed for NASA that was not made to measure, instead being modular in a way that allowed for suits to be resized on orbit for different astronauts. The EMU was developed over a period of nearly an entire decade, with its development contract first being given to Hamilton Standard and ILC Dover in 1974, and the first suits being delivered in 1982. During the R&D phase, sometime between 1975 and 1980, a serious accident occurred that set back development significantly. A prototype suit was being pressure tested for EVA mode, and it very suddenly caught fire. Traced back to the regulator, investigators struggled to identify the exact cause of the fire that badly injured several technicians, one badly enough to have suffered burns on 30% of his body. The difficulty in identifying the exact cause of the fire forced a full redesign of both the regulator and circulation fan. Finally, by 1982, the finished EMU design was ready. Let's go through the layers. Much like previous suits, the EMU has about 14 of them. At the very bottom is what is called a maximum absorbency garment, basically a fancy name for an adult diaper, as well as some kind of thermal control undergarment such as long johns. On top of this, a new version of a liquid cooling garment is worn, with the integrated tubing that uses water to cool the wearer. After that, the astronaut begins putting on the spacesuit assembly, or SSA, beginning with the lower torso assembly, or LTA. Get ready for a lot of acronyms. The LTA consists of the waist bearing and the legs and boots, and after donning this portion, the astronaut would move into an airlock for the pre-breathing procedure. During this time, they don the HUT, or hard upper torso assembly, which includes the arms, gloves, an Apollo-style helmet and a visor assembly, and connections for the cooling garment and the rest of the suit to fit with the life support backpack. After all the connections are made, the HUT and LTA are fixed together with the body seal closure, and the suit is powered on and tested. The astronaut then dons the iconic Snoopy cap used since the Apollo era, which contains communications equipment, and locks in the gloves and boots of the suit. The suit's fans and regulators are activated and it is properly pressurized. The suit also contains a chest piece that serves two purposes. It is a display and control module that allows them to communicate, track the suit's systems, and operate other functions, but also serves as a mounting spot for a mini workstation containing tools and storage areas. Most of what the astronaut needs to do EVA work is physically on the suit itself, streamlining the process significantly. The EMU can support an astronaut for up to 8.5 hours and can be used around 25 times before it's returned to the ground for refurbishment, unlike the Orlan, which is destroyed at the end of its life. On the space shuttle, the astronaut needed to pre-breathe for 45 minutes, after the entire shuttle's atmosphere was reduced a full 24 hours before the pre-breathing. On the ISS, astronauts pre-breathe for 4 hours, but since 2006 have adopted a procedure of camping out in the Quest airlock module for a full day before doing a spacewalk, with the atmosphere being adjusted specifically for them, while work on the rest of the station continues uninterrupted. The EMU was first used in 1982 on STS-6 after a failure of the electrical circulating fan caused it to be rescheduled from STS-5. Astronauts Story Musgrave and Donald Peterson entered the payload bay of Shuttle Challenger for 4 hours, primarily testing techniques for using the brand new suit. As EMU suits can be refurbished once they reach their use limit, to date only 18 of them have ever been manufactured, with 5 lost during missions, 1 lost in a ground test, and as of 2017, 11 of them remain. What's that? Those numbers don't add up? No, they don't. I'm guessing one of them simply couldn't be refurbished at the end of its lifetime and was discarded, but I can't actually say for sure. From 1998 onward, the EMU was slightly redesigned into the Enhanced EMU, the model currently used. There were a number of interesting ideas floated during this time, the most notable being the Manned Maneuvering Unit, or MMU. First tested during the Skylab era, the MMU allowed an astronaut to perform an untethered spacewalk in the same way that the USAF Astronaut Maneuvering Unit was supposed to, by moving around with a controlled jetpack on their backs. The MMU was first tested in open space on STS-41B, when astronaut Bruce McCandless performed a test flight that created one of the most iconic photos in spaceflight history. He successfully maneuvered up to 322 feet away from Shuttle Challenger before coming back in again. Later, the MMU was used to retrieve 2 malfunctioning satellites on a later mission, but was judged too risky for use in the wake of the 1986 Challenger disaster. A smaller replacement called SAFER was designed, standing for Simplified Aid for EVA Rescue, which is reserved solely for allowing an astronaut to return to the ISS in the near-impossible event of a broken tether. The Soviets and Russians also had an MMU equivalent called the SPK. It was tested aboard Mir a couple of times, but like the MMU, never saw much practical use and was eventually retired. They initially stowed it in the airlock aboard Mir, but because it was bulky and took up a lot of space, they eventually stowed it outside, as can be seen here. Now, no discussion about the EMU would be complete without mentioning EVA-23. On July 16, 2013, Italian ESA astronaut Luca Parmitano was performing his second spacewalk of Expedition 36/37. Intending to last over 6 hours, the spacewalk was terminated after only 92 minutes when Parmitano reported a serious problem with his helmet. First, he noted that a CO2 sensor within the suit had stopped functioning, and then shortly afterwards, noticed that the back of his head felt unusually wet. As he monitored the situation, he reported to Mission Control that his helmet had begun to fill with water. Demonstrating tremendous grace under pressure, Parmitano began to make his way back to the airlock, helped along by fellow astronaut Chris Cassidy, while his helmet continued to fill with more and more water. Thankfully, he was able to get back inside the airlock and remove the suit's helmet before he was in serious danger of choking or, worse, drowning. Eventually, the cause of the water leak was traced back to a clogged filter, which caused a backup of the cooling system. Though there was another, similar, less serious incident in 2016, these are the only times that an EMU ever caused significant danger to an astronaut. Now, let's go back in time a little, since I structured this a little strangely. It's hard to organize chronologically with all of the overlap between the lifetimes of different suits. What about the shuttle, specifically during ascent and re-entry? Did the shuttle have some version of the Sokol? It sure did, and their histories run strangely and darkly parallel. On the first 4 shuttle flights, as they were deemed test flights, the layout was a little atypical. Shuttle Columbia was fitted with emergency ejection seats, roof panels on the orbiter designed to blow away in the case of an emergency to allow the 2 test pilots to get out in a hurry. For these flights, they wore a special suit called the Shuttle Ejection Escape Suit. Look familiar? That's because it is. This is essentially just a lightly modified version of the SR-71 pressure suit, so there isn't a whole lot to say about it. We've seen this suit before. When the shuttle was declared operational with STS-5, these suits were dropped in favor of simple blue flight suits similar to early Soyuz flights. And like the Soyuz, it was disaster that prompted a change in procedure. Following the loss of 7 astronauts and the workhorse of the orbiter fleet in the 1986 Challenger disaster, the pumpkin suit was introduced. Officially called the Launch Entry Suit, these suits were worn from STS-26 to STS-88 in 1994. The Launch Entry Suit functioned almost identically to the previous Ejection Escape Suit, and the orange color was given simply to make it stand out against the water it would need to be spotted in. Following their being phased out, the LES was replaced with the ACES, or Advanced Crew Escape Suit. Now a full pressure suit, ACES provided advanced protection against the elements, a life support system strapped to the thigh, a survival backpack that included an inflatable raft, and was designed to be fully applied and activated much faster than the LES. There was only one occasion during which ACES could have been used, in the 2003 Shuttle Columbia disaster, but all of the suits were found to have failed because the astronauts had not used them correctly. None of their helmets were sealed, and many weren't wearing gloves. Both of the shuttle's disasters occurred at times when the world, and the crews, were beginning to see spaceflight as something that could be done routinely and safely. There was just enough of a gap between STS-51L with Challenger and STS-107 with Columbia that the crew felt safe in not donning all of their PPE. Would it have mattered? It's hard to say. A similar accident involving the SR-71 resulted in a crew member coming out alive after ejecting at Mach 3, but the conditions during Columbia's breakup were significantly more severe. It's likely that properly wearing their suits wouldn't have saved the crew anyway, but we will never know. There's 2 more American spacesuits to talk about, though not too much because they're all quite new. Well, 3 technically, since 2 of them are intrinsically linked. In 2015, SpaceX developed the Starman EVA suit, meant only for use inside of the Crew Dragon spacecraft. An incredibly slim and simple-looking suit, it works similarly to Sokol suits in that pressure is derived from the spacecraft via a tether connected near the knee and is not meant for spacewalks in any way. It's merely an emergency measure to keep the wearers safe in the case that the Dragon were to suddenly lose pressure. It also consists of a single piece, much like other Russian suits, with a 3D printed helmet not being detachable and worn together with the rest of the suit. There is, however, something to be said about the futuristic look of them and what that does to the public perception of spaceflight. Good PR helps, people. It really does, and the Starman suits provide very good PR. The suit was first worn in flight on the Demo 2 mission in 2020, and has since been used for around a dozen trips to the ISS, as well as for the Inspiration 4 privately funded mission. In May of 2024, SpaceX unveiled an EVA suit directly adapted from the Starman suit for use in the Polaris program. Utilizing new materials adapted from the Falcon 9 inner stage and the Crew Dragon unpressurized trunk, it features increased mobility and an internal heads-up display within the helmet. Like the EVA suit, it does not have its own life support derived via a tether with the Dragon spacecraft. So far, the suit has only been tested once on the Polaris Dawn mission, the first private spacewalk in history. The only other suit to mention, again briefly, is Boeing Blue, the suit used for the Boeing Starliner spacecraft. It's a bit of a misleading name. Boeing didn't make them at all, the David Clark Company did. However, they're meant for use on Starliner and were contracted by Boeing, so they carry the Boeing name. Similar in function to the Starman suit, though more closely resembling an orange NASA flight suit, Blue works solely in the Starliner spacecraft, and in fact has only been used once for half of a trip. After problems occurred on Starliner's first crewed test flight, the spacecraft was returned without crew who, at the time of writing these words, remain on the space station to be returned to Earth via a SpaceX Crew Dragon in February of 2025. At this point, the future of Starliner, and therefore the future of the Boeing Blue suit, remain very uncertain. Now, before we move on to future suits, who else goes on spacewalks? Surprisingly, only one other nation outside of the USA and the USSR/Russia have ever independently performed spacewalks: China. The China Manned Space Program, or CMSA, approved in 1992, had a second phase goal of developing independent spacewalk capabilities. In the early 2000s, they signed an agreement with Russia to import a handful of Orlan suits, which the agency then used to design their own suit, the Feitien. It was first completed in 2006 and first used in 2008 on Shenzhou 7. Unfortunately, China is quite famously not very open about the details of its space program, so there isn't a whole lot of information on how this suit works, at least not in English. However, judging purely from photos, the Orlan influence seems pretty clear. It appears to be a singular piece and is likely entered via a rear hatch and has similar capabilities to the Orlan, with the second generation suit providing up to 6 hours of life support. It continues to be used with some regularity on China's current space station, Tianyong, with at least 13 spacewalks being performed since last year. So, what's next for the future of spacesuits? Well, we have 2 things to consider here, and eventually a third, but we're not quite there yet. The first is an EMU replacement, as the design is at this point 40 years old. The second is a next-generation version of the Apollo suits for when mankind inevitably returns to the moon with the Artemis program. So, why not kill 2 birds with 1 stone? In 2022, NASA contracted Axiom and Collins Aerospace to develop their next generation of spacesuit, which will both be used for spacewalks in low Earth orbit, as well as for traversing the lunar surface. Initially being called the XEMU, standing for Exploration Extravehicular Mobility Unit, the intention is to provide further mobility by using advanced materials and joint bearings that allow for bending and rotating at the hips, knees, and soles of the feet. For the upper portion, modifications will allow astronauts to reach above their heads and across their bodies in ways that they previously couldn't, improving sample collection and operation of tools. The suits are intended to be modular and evolvable, easily adapting to multiple destinations. Not only will one version be oriented toward zero-gravity spacewalks, another will be oriented toward walking on the moon, and another can be easily upgraded and modified to withstand the challenges of the environment on Mars. In October of 2024, Axiom Space revealed the flight design of what is now being called the AxiEMU, designed in collaboration with Prada. Statements provided say the new suit has greatly improved flexibility and performance with a one-size-fits-all design that includes lights, high-definition cameras, LTE communications, and even in-suit nutrition, presumably something similar to the helmet-borne energy bars kept in A7LB suits. Throughout its history, the Artemis program has faced significant challenges and delays, not the least of which has been in designing new spacesuits, but it seems that finally, significant progress is being made in that department. As the design is proprietary, not all the details of how the AxiEMU works is currently public, but statements have been made regarding addressing previous problems such as the razor-sharp lunar regolith slowly eating away at the suits. Somehow, we shall likely soon see how, these suits will make for a much easier experience in exploring the harsh lunar environment. What comes after that? Well, Mars. What will Mars suits look like? Well, based on what's going on right now, a lot like the AxiEMU, since it's intended to be easily modifiable. A Mars suit isn't likely to look like the smooth, futuristic style of something like, say, The Martian. In fact, they'll probably look more like the suits featured in For All Mankind, since the costume design in that show was directly inspired by the AxiEMU. Despite the environments being radically different, from the Moon to Mars, a suit faces roughly the same challenges. You still need a fully enclosed, pressurized environment for the astronaut to be in, you still need to provide breathable air and temperature regulation, and you still have to make it as flexible as possible while doing all of that. The truth is that regardless of destination, spacesuit design isn't likely to change without the technology they're made from significantly changing. As cool as they look, you won't see the golden sun suits from Sunshine anytime soon. Perhaps thousands of years in the future, when human life has evolved to survive on different planets, we'll start to see some real variation based on the physical requirements of the suit. Of course, we're talking a long time into the future, when humans are basically unrecognizable from what they are today. When we need a suit that will fit a shark girl like Gargura, we'll start to see some interesting stuff. Yes, I found a way to fit her into the video solely because I had this artwork commissioned and I wanted to show it off. I'm gonna frame this and put it on my wall. Look at it. Just look at it. Thank you very, very much, Asivarius Tippeline. The art is absolutely beautiful. I do these things because I'm a devoted chum buddy, and I really want to integrate the spaceflight world with the VTuber world. If you've seen my Twitter account, you'll know I already try to do that. Or if you saw my Starship Flight 5 watch-along. The Starship launch is sponsored by Fuamoko! Bow bow! As usual, I left out quite a bit of stuff in this video. If I laboriously explained every detail of every suit and every possibility, we'd be looking at a 4-hour video minimum, and while some of you may want that, most people don't. I've done my best to make this digestible, but at the same time, I cut out some information because I want to encourage you to learn on your own. If you're curious about how one of these suits accomplished something, take to the internet. Seek out NASA documents, Roscosmos documents, books on these subjects. Consume as much information as you can. Learn to learn on your own. Become an autodidact like me. It's a lot of fun. We took quite the journey when it came to putting a human being into the harshest environment imaginable. From fanciful imagination to emulating the underwater world, from pressure suits to full mobility units, we looked at an environment that is actively telling us no, stay away, and we said, bet. We did the math, realized our blood would boil in our veins, our bodies would freeze solid, and we would quickly asphyxiate. We saw the horrifying results of being exposed to space and said, nah, I'd live. And we figured out a way to do that. Spacesuits are a tribute to the truth of the indomitable human spirit. Nothing will ever hold us back. We will go wherever we want to go. Ad astra per aspera. Through hardship to the stars.